Okay, so let's get into this.
Yeah.
We're diving into a feature who's sparked endless debate. George Zimmerman. Vigilante, or did he stand his ground? This is a deep dive where every detail matters. Court documents, news reports, even Zimmerman's own words. We're going to try to understand the man behind the headlines. Answer that question. Grifter
Mm-hmm.
or gifted?
You know what's so fascinating about this case? It forces us to look at our own biases.
Yeah.
How do you separate fact from feeling in a situation that's so charged? I mean, you have race, self-defense, and the whole idea of justice wrapped up in one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about that one night in Florida. It's about how we form opinions in general and if we're even willing to look at things objectively.
Totally.
Yeah.
So February 26, 2012, Sanford, Florida. Gated community called the Retreat at Twin Lakes. Sounds peaceful, right?
Yeah.
But that's where 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was fatally shot by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer.
And the community itself kind of adds another layer to all of this. They'd seen an increase in crime. And Zimmerman was the coordinator of the watch program. He'd called the police a bunch of times before this.
Yeah, and here's the thing. The police specifically told these watch volunteers, don't confront anyone, just report any suspicious activity. That instruction becomes crucial later.
Yeah, because Zimmerman says he was just defending himself after being attacked by Martin.
But Martin's family and supporters say Zimmerman racially profiled him, starting the whole confrontation that led to Martin's death. And they point to the fact that Martin was unarmed.
Two completely different stories. And that's really what the trial was all about, which of course became a media frenzy. Florida's stand your ground law was under a microscope. Essentially, it allows people to use deadly force if they reasonably believe they're in serious danger. So you don't have to back down if you think your life is at risk.
Right, so the jury had to figure out if a reasonable person in Zimmerman's shoes would have felt threatened enough to shoot.
And after more than 16 hours of deliberation, they found him not guilty of both second-degree murder and manslaughter.
And this is when you see that huge public reaction. Protests all over the country. People are outraged, feeling like justice wasn't served. This case reignites all these debates about racial profiling, self-defense laws, and if the legal system is even fair.
And Zimmerman didn't exactly help calm things down after the trial. He tried to auction off the gun that killed Trayvon Martin, saying the money would go towards fighting Black Lives Matter violence. He even praised someone who vandalized a black cultural center, almost encouraging more of that behavior.
And here's where that grifter or gifted question gets really interesting. Is this a guy standing up for what he believes in? Or is he trying to cash in on this tragedy? I mean, we have to look at the pattern of his behavior.
You're right, it doesn't stop there. He's been in a bunch of other incidents involving assault, domestic violence, even threats. He threatened Jay-Z for making a documentary about Trayvon Martin. He even brought up a 13-foot alligator in his text to the private investigator.
And we have to see all of this in light of that Yale study. They found that a lot of people made up their minds about Zimmerman's guilt based on their existing beliefs, ignoring evidence that didn't fit their viewpoint. Motivated reasoning.
So people were searching for evidence to support their own opinion of him, hero or villain.
Exactly. Which leads to a big question for our deep dive today. Can we even be objective as individuals, as a society, when dealing with someone like Zimmerman who's so polarizing?
Right, you can't just say, oh, he's a bad guy and move on. We have to ask, what's driving him? Is there a consistent pattern here? Any signs of change, remorse?
Yeah. We got to go beyond the headlines and the emotional reactions and analyze his actions, his words, and the actual evidence.
Let's start with that trial. A lot hinged on Florida's stand your ground law. Zimmerman's lawyers argued he was justified in shooting because he feared for his life. But the prosecution said he started it, making the use of deadly force unjustified.
And remember, with stand your ground, there's no duty to retreat. If you feel like you're in danger, you can use force. So the jury had to figure out if Zimmerman's fear was reasonable. And that wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't. And then you've got conflicting accounts from eyewitnesses. Questions about whether certain evidence should have even been allowed, like those 911 calls from that night.
It becomes this battle of narratives. The prosecution tried to paint Zimmerman as a profiler, going after Martin even though he wasn't doing anything wrong. Zimmerman's team tried to make Martin out to be the aggressor, bringing up the marijuana in his system, even suggesting he had a history of violence.
Which a lot of people saw as victim blaming, trying to shift the focus away from the person who pulled the trigger.
Oh, right. And this is another important piece of our grifter or gifted analysis, is self-preservation, a genuine belief that he's innocent, or a calculated move to manipulate the story.
It's complicated. Then there's the question of who sees George Zimmerman as a hero. and why. We know he has supporters who see him as a symbol of self-reliance, of standing up to perceived threats. One article we have actually calls it a narrative of righteous slaughter, defending your home, your family against outsiders.
That's a powerful phrase. It really gets at what makes this whole case so divisive. It taps into those deep anxieties we have about safety, about who belongs and who doesn't.
And we also have to consider the racial dynamics. Zimmerman being Hispanic, Martin being black. It absolutely colored how people viewed the case.
This case became a flashpoint for talking about racial profiling and systemic racism. It forced America to confront some hard truths about how race affects our lives, our perceptions of guilt and innocence.
But remember that Yale study we talked about motivated reasoning. It found that people often decided on Zimmerman's guilt based on what they already believed about race, guns, even justice itself. They weren't necessarily looking at the evidence objectively.
Which brings us back to that crucial question. How do we navigate a world where charisma and controversy are so intertwined? How do we separate a visionary from a con artist? In Zimmerman's case, is he a changed man, a victim of circumstance, or someone who thrives on chaos and attention?
So as we go deeper into this, we're not just trying to figure out what happened that night. We're trying to understand George Zimmerman himself.
We have to ask, what are the patterns in his behavior? Are there signs of remorse, accountability? Or do we see manipulation, a desire for notoriety?
And to do that, we'll need to look at his actions and his words, both during the trial and in the years since.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what really stands out to me is how every single part of this case just seems to hit you right in the feels. The setting, the people, the legal back and forth, it all plays into these deepest fears and anxieties we all have.
It really is like watching some kind of real-life drama play out, and it makes it so much harder to be objective about it. But that's what we try to do, right? Sift through all that noise, all that emotion, and try to figure out what really happened.
And more importantly, who is George Zimmerman?
Exactly, because if we just react emotionally, we're letting our feelings cloud our judgment. It's that trap of motivated reasoning, choosing sides based on what we feel rather than what the facts say. And that's what we got to watch out for if we really want to figure out if Zimmerman is a grifter or, gifted.
Okay, so let's try to keep things objective here. Let's focus on some specific things Zimmerman did after the trial. We talked about the gun auction and those comments about vandalism. But there are other things, too, that raise some eyebrows, like getting banned from those dating apps for making fake profiles. And that whole thing with threatening Jay-Z.
Right, and those things might seem like they're just tabloid stuff, but they're actually pretty revealing. You see a pattern of attention-seeking behavior, a willingness to escalate things, and a real lack of remorse. It makes you wonder, is he really just someone who believes he's innocent and he's lashing out at anyone who disagrees with him? Or is it all calculated, this way of keeping himself in the spotlight? Maybe even a way to make money off of being notorious.
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer it, we have to think about why he's doing these things. Is it some kind of misguided sense of righteousness, revenge against people he sees as enemies? Or is it cold and calculated, all about attention and getting rich?
And what about his personal relationships? His wife at the time, Shelley Dean, filed for divorce after he was acquitted. She said the whole thing just tore them apart.
That's something we forget about with these big, high-profile cases. Real people, real lives getting affected by all of this.
It's true. It's important to remember Zimmerman isn't just a symbol or a topic for debate. He's a human being with a past relationships, experiences that have made him who he is. But that doesn't excuse what he did.
No, it doesn't. It just makes our analysis even more complicated.
Yeah.
We got to ask ourselves, how did his past, how he was raised, his personality, how did all that play into his actions? Are there any signs of trauma, mental health issues, hidden reasons that might explain why he acts the way he does?
It's like a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. You have to look at everything from every angle if you want to get anywhere near the truth.
Okay, so let's talk about the media coverage for a sec. They had a huge influence on what the public thought about all of this. This case was a media circus from day one.
It had it, all right. Race, violence, this controversial legal battle. And Zimmerman himself was pretty charismatic, not afraid to speak his mind, perfect for the 24-hour news cycle.
And all that coverage, it just made everything so much more intense, especially with social media fanning the flames. A lot of times the media oversimplified things, which just reinforced people's biases, divided people even more instead of helping them understand.
And there was a lot of straight-up misinformation and sensationalism. Remember when NBC edited that 911 call to make it sound like Zimmerman was racially profiling Martin? They apologized, but the damage was done.
It shows you how dangerous media bias can be, especially with something as sensitive as race and justice. We can't just blindly consume media, especially when things are this emotionally charged.
And this was before fake news and deepfakes took off. Today, it'd be given harder to know what's real and what's not in a case like this.
Absolutely. Which makes our deep dive approach even more important. We're not just sitting back and absorbing information, we're dissecting it, questioning it, searching for a deeper meaning.
We're trying to be smarter about the media we consume, better equipped to navigate this whole crazy world of information.
Now, some media outlets were definitely more sympathetic to Zimmerman's self-defense claim, especially the ones leaning conservative. They portrayed him as this victim of a politically motivated prosecution, like he was being unfairly targeted.
And you had this split in coverage. People on both sides accusing each other of bias and twisting the facts. It felt like people were watching totally different trials, depending on what news they followed.
It's a perfect example of how these media narratives feed into themselves. People tend to gravitate towards sources that just confirm what they already believe. It makes it really hard to bridge the gap and actually have productive conversations.
And when we're thinking about this grifter or gifted question, the media's role becomes even more crucial. Was Zimmerman purposely manipulating the media to make himself look like a victim? Or was he just looking for support and understanding from people who agreed with him?
It's a question that requires us to really look closely at how he interacted with the media. His public statements, what his legal team was doing. We have to look for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that seems like deliberate manipulation.
Right. It's not just what he said, but how he said it. His body language, his tone of voice, even the words he chose. All of those things can tell us something about what he's really thinking.
Absolutely. We're basically detectives here, looking to clues of a carefully constructed persona designed to make people feel sorry for him or even admire him.
And remember, even the little things can be revealing, like what he wore to court, his social media posts, how he acted around his supporters. It can all give you some insight into his state of mind and what motivates him.
Exactly. And it's our job to take all those seemingly unrelated pieces and try to put them together to create a clearer picture of the man behind the headlines.
Now, even though we're trying to be objective here, we can't forget about the real impact this case had on the people involved. We talked about Zimmerman's ex-wife, but what about Trayvon Martin's parents? Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. They've become these incredible advocates for social justice and ending gun violence.
They took their grief and turned it into action. They started the Trayvon Martin Foundation to empower communities and work towards a world without gun violence. They've also been pushing for changes in laws to address racial profiling and encourage responsible gun ownership.
Their strength and resilience after losing their son is truly inspiring.
Absolutely. Their story shows us that even in the face of tragedy, there can be hope and a commitment to making the world a better place.
And it shows you how far-reaching the effects of this case have been. It wasn't just a legal fight. It sparked a movement for change, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society.
The Zimmerman case became a symbol of the deep racial divide in America and the injustices that are baked into the system. It started a national conversation about race privilege, the need for real reform.
And that conversation is still going on today, even more so after the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others.
The Zimmerman case, as awful as it was, served as a wake-up call for a lot of people. It exposed the serious flaws in our justice system and the urgent need to deal with racial bias and inequality.
It's a reminder that the fight for justice never ends. It takes constant vigilance, unwavering commitment, and the willingness to challenge the way things are.
Now, as we dig deeper into this question of grifter or gifted, we have to consider the psychological and sociological factors that might have influenced Zimmerman's actions.
You mean like what was going on in his head that night?
Exactly. We need to go beyond the surface here. Try to understand what might have been driving him. Okay, so let's start with the psychology of self-defense. When we feel threatened, our instinct is to protect ourselves. It's that fight or flight response. It's wired into our brains. But the key word here is feel. What one person sees as a threat, another person might not. And how we perceive things is shaped by our own experiences, our cultural biases, even our emotions at that moment.
So what Zimmerman saw as a life or death situation, someone else might have seen it totally differently. Or even Zimmerman himself on a different day.
Exactly. And that's where implicit bias comes in. These are those unconscious attitudes and stereotypes we all have, based on race, gender, other social categories. They can affect our decisions without us even realizing it.
So Zimmerman's view of Martin as a threat It's possible that was influenced by implicit racial bias. Maybe he wasn't even aware of it.
There's research that shows people are more likely to see black men as dangerous compared to white men, even when they're doing the exact same thing.
And that bias can have tragic consequences, as we've seen here.
And let's think about neighborhood watch programs for a minute.
Yes.
They're supposed to prevent crime by having people be more observant and report anything suspicious to the police.
But the problem is they can unintentionally create this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, which sometimes leads to racial profiling and excessive force.
Studies have shown that people in these programs are more likely to report black people for suspicious behavior than white people, even when they're doing the same things.
And that's because of implicit bias again. They're subconsciously linking blackness with crime.
Exactly. And remember, Zimmerman had a history of calling the police on black people in his neighborhood. His role as a watch volunteer might have made him even more suspicious and more likely to confront someone like Trayvon Martin.
Like he was just waiting for a threat to appear. And sadly that night, that perceived threat was a young black man walking home from the store.
And we can't ignore the role of gun culture in all of this.
Yeah, the U.S. is unique in its relationship with guns. There are a lot of guns out there. And they're deeply connected to how we see ourselves as a nation. And that affects how we think about violence, self-defense, the police.
And Zimmerman was carrying a gun that night. He had a permit for it.
Right, and Florida's stand your ground law makes it easier to use deadly force in self-defense, even if you could have just walked away. So the fact that he had a gun and the laws around self-defense, they probably played a role in what happened.
Absolutely. It speaks to the bigger issue of how easy it is to get guns in America and what can happen because of that, especially when you combine it with laws that make it easier to use them.
So as we keep exploring this grifter or gifted question, we have to think about how Zimmerman's worldview, his perspective shaped by all these social and cultural forces, how that might have influenced what he did that night.
Did he truly believe he was in danger? Or did his biases and assumptions about black men make him overreact?
Was it a tragic consequence of how he was raised, his environment, how he saw the world? Or was it a deliberate act of violence driven by something darker?
These are the tough questions we have to wrestle with if we want to understand this case and the man at the center of it.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to remember that the Zimmerman case wasn't just about one incident. It had a huge impact on how we talk about race, justice, gun violence as a country.
It forced us to look at ourselves and face some hard truths, and those conversations are even more important now than ever.
You're right, and I think it's a good time to take a break and let our listeners digest all of this. When we come back, we'll look at what happened after the trial, Zimmerman's legacy, and what this case can teach us about navigating a world where charisma and controversy go hand in hand. All right, so we've gone through everything leading up to the trial itself, and all the complicated stuff that might have affected Zimmerman's actions. But it doesn't end there. The Zimmerman case had a lasting impact, not just on the people involved, but on the whole conversation about race and justice in America.
Yeah, this wasn't just some legal case. It was like a cultural earthquake. We had to face some hard truths about ourselves and our society.
And I think one of the biggest aftershocks was the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right. The fact that Zimmerman was acquitted. For a lot of people, that showed the deep inequality in the justice system, how black lives are devalued, and how black people are treated with impunity.
It was like a spark that set off a firestorm of frustration and anger, protests and demonstrations all over the country.
And social media played a huge role in that, giving those voices a platform, helping organize protests, spreading awareness about the case and what it meant for everyone.
You mentioned the hashtag Justice for Trayvon earlier. It really became a rallying cry for a whole generation demanding change.
Social media became this space where people could share their stories, express their outrage, and come together to demand justice for Trayvon Martin, and for George Zimmerman to be held accountable.
It also gave people a way to challenge the stories that were being told in the mainstream media, which often downplayed the role of race and focused on Zimmerman saying it was self-defense.
It let people, especially black people, tell their own stories, share their own experiences with racial profiling and prejudice, and connect with others who understood what they were going through.
It was a turning point for social justice movements. It showed how powerful digital platforms can be for amplifying voices that are often silenced, and for challenging the way things are.
And the Black Lives Matter movement, even though it started with the Zimmerman case, it's become this global phenomenon, demanding systemic change and an end to racial injustice in every form.
It shows you the impact this case had and how dedicated activists are to making sure Trayvon Martin's death wasn't in vain.
So let's get back to Zimmerman. What's he been doing since the trial? Has he shown any remorse, taken any responsibility for his actions, or has he just kept portraying himself as the victim?
These are important questions for figuring out if he's a grifter or gifted. Has he used this platform for something good? Or has he just tried to exploit it for his own benefit?
Well, he's mostly stayed out of the public eye, but every now and then he pops up, and usually is something that stirs up more controversy.
Like when he tried to auction off the gun he used in the shooting,
Yeah.
a lot of people saw that as a really disrespectful way to try and profit from a tragedy.
Right, and then there was that whole thing with threatening Jay-Z and all those other incidents he's been involved in, like that fight with the process server who was just trying to do his job.
It makes you question his character
Hmm?
and whether he's even capable of moving on from what happened that night.
That suggests a pattern of aggression, a lack of remorse, like he's always ready for a fight.
You have to wonder, is he trapped by this case? Or is he purposely looking for trouble and attention?
That's something psychologists and sociologists have gone back and forth on. Some say he's got PTSD, others say he's a narcissist who loves the attention and notoriety.
Well, whatever the reason, it's obvious that the Zimmerman case has had a huge impact on his life.
He's always going to be connected to Trayvon Martin's death, and everything he's done since the trial has just reinforced his image as a controversial figure.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we should reflect on what we can learn from the Zimmerman case. It's a story about race, justice, the whole idea of self-defense. But it's also about how powerful narratives can be, the influence of the media, and how important critical thinking is.
We've seen how easy it is for our biases to affect our judgment, how media stories can shape what we believe, and how social media can be used for both good and bad.
This case forces us to look at our own beliefs, question our assumptions, and have real conversations about difficult subjects.
It reminds us that the truth isn't always clear, and that justice isn't always served. But it also inspires us to keep fighting for a world that's more fair and just. A world where tragedies like Trayvon Martin's death don't happen anymore.
So as we close out this deep dive into George Zimmerman's life and legacy, I want to leave you with this. Trying to figure out if he's a grifter or gifted isn't about reaching a final verdict. It's about thinking critically, challenging what we think we know, and recognizing that human beings are complicated. In a world where charisma and controversy are often intertwined, it's more important than ever to be discerning, to look for different perspectives, and to never stop questioning.